Hey everybody, it's Brian here. So this here is a monument to our Confederate dead in Georgetown, Texas. It was erected in 1916. Now in 1914, this woman, Laura Martin Rose, who within a couple of years was going to be the Historian General of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. That's the group that put this up. They still exist. She wrote a little textbook for the public schools, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy had a lot of control over what was in the public schools at the time. So this was actually a public school textbook. It was called The Ku Klux Klan, or Invisible Empire. It opens with, "This book is dedicated by the author to the youth of the Southland, hoping that a perusal of its pages will inspire them with respect and admiration for the Confederate soldiers, who were the real Ku Klux, and whose deeds of courage and valor have never been surpassed and rarely equaled in the annals of history." And this statue in particular says that it is in memory of the Confederate soldiers and sailors erected under the auspices of the UDC. No braver patriots ever fought, no braver deeds were ever wrought. So we know what they had in mind when they were trying to build this thing. They were explicitly, avowedly supporting the Ku Klux Klan, which they identified with the Confederacy. But you don't even have to take the United Daughters of the Confederacy's word for it from 50 years after the war, because the founding fathers of Texas secession from the United States and entrance into the Confederacy had the decency to write down why it is that they were seceding. And they actually happened to do it in a way that exactly fits into a little pamphlet. It was very thoughtful of them. So I'm just going to tell you what they wrote. A lot of people are not interested in looking up these kinds of documents, even though this one's easy to find online. So here you go, February 2nd, 1861. The government of the United States, by certain joint resolutions bearing date the 1st of March in the year AD 1845, proposed to the Republic of Texas, then a free sovereign and independent nation, the annexation of the latter to the former as one of the co-equal states thereof. The people of Texas, by deputies in convention assembled on the 4th day of July of the same year, assented to and accepted said proposals and formed a constitution for the proposed state, upon which on the 29th day of December of the same year, the said state was formally admitted to the Confederate Union. And it's a little bit confusing, but a lot of people used the Confederacy as their word for the United States until the actual Confederate States of America were formed, because it just means a federal grouping. So whenever you're reading something from before 1861 and people are talking about leaving the Confederacy, they're talking about leaving the United States. Texas abandoned her separate national existence and consented to become one of the Confederate Union, that is the United States, or Confederated Union, to promote her welfare, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure more substantially the blessings of peace and liberty to her people. She was received into the Confederacy with her own constitution, under the guarantee of the federal constitution, the compact of annexation, that she should enjoy these blessings. She was received as a commonwealth holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits. That is, mind you, the entire races are being distinguished there, and it's the first emphasized point. A relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. Her institutions and geographical position established the strongest ties between her and other slaveholding states of the Confederacy, again the United States. Those ties have been strengthened by association. But what has been the course of the government of the United States and of the people and authorities of the non-slaveholding states since our connection with them? The controlling majority of the federal government, under various pretenses and disguises, has so administered the same as to exclude the citizens of the southern states unless under odious and unconstitutional restrictions from all the immense territory owned in the common by all the states on the Pacific Ocean, for the avowed purpose of acquiring sufficient power in the common government to use it as a means of destroying the institutions of Texas and her sister slaveholding states. And to be clear, nobody was trying to exclude Southerners from the territories. They were trying to exclude slave ownership from the territories. If you were from Louisiana, you wanted to move to Arizona before it was a state, you were welcome to do so. You just couldn't take your slaves with you. By the disloyalty of the northern states and their citizens and the imbecility of the federal government, infamous combinations of incendiaries and outlaws have been permitted in those states in the common territory of Kansas to trample upon the federal laws, to war upon the lives and property of southern citizens in that territory, and finally by violence and mob law to usurp the possession of the same as exclusively the property of the northern states. There was a guerrilla war in Kansas, which we know as Bleeding Kansas. A small number of slaveholders slaveholders moved in. They didn't even bring their slaves because it didn't make any sense there agriculturally. They tried to create their own constitution through fraud. It didn't work out. The federal government, while but partially under the control of these our unnatural and sectional enemies, has for years almost entirely failed to protect the lives and property of the people of Texas against the Indian savages of our border. So there was a constant ethnic cleansing conflict as Texans tried to encroach on indigenous land. Sam Houston, for the past year and a half or so before the secession, had not been doing a great job of settling everybody's nerves about it. A lot of people on the border specifically were not interested in secession, specifically because they looked to the federal government for protection from Indian raids. More recently, against the murderous forays of banditti from the neighboring territory of Mexico, and this is a reference to some fussing that had been going on in the Rio Grande Valley involving a guy named Juan Cortina. He was a major landholder on both sides of the Rio Grande. It was complicated. He actually seized Brownsville for a few days. And when our state government has expended large amounts for such purpose, the federal government has refused reimbursement therefor, thus rendering our condition more insecure and harassing than it was during the existence of the Republic of Texas. These and other wrongs we've patiently borne in the vain hope that a returning sense of justice and humanity would induce a different course of administration. So there's a mention of protection against Indians and Mexicans, and let's see whether there are any other issues mentioned to justify the secession. When we advert to the course of individual non-slaveholding states and the majority of their citizens, our grievances assume far greater magnitude. The states of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa, by solemn legislative enactments, have deliberately, directly, or indirectly violated the third clause of the second section of the fourth article, that is, the Fugitive Slave Clause, of the federal Constitution, and laws passed in pursuance thereof. That is to say, they were telling their law enforcement in those states not to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves, thereby annulling a material provision of the compact designed by its framers to perpetuate the amity between the members of the Confederacy, that is the United States, and to secure the rights of the slaveholding states in their domestic institutions, a provision founded in justice and wisdom, and without the enforcement of which the compact fails to accomplish the object of its creation. Right, so according to Texas, the point of the Constitution was to protect slavery, and if a bunch of northern states aren't protecting slavery, what is even the point of being in the same country with them? Some of those states have imposed high fines and degrading penalties upon any of their citizens or officers who may carry out in good faith that provision of the compact or the federal laws enacted in accordance therewith. In the non-slaveholding states, in violation of that good faith and comity which should exist between entirely distinct nations, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party, it's the Republican Party, now strong enough in numbers to control the affairs of each of those states based on, so they formed this party based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery. Right, so according to the Texans, the Republican Party was an abolitionist party. It wasn't, but the Southerners were not responding to what we think the Republican Party was. They were responding to what they thought the Republican Party was. It's the fallacy of presentism to assume that these Texan leaders 150 years ago thought the same way that we do. We know that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. They didn't know that. All right, so this party was now strong enough in numbers to control the affairs of each of those states based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of the equality of all men. That was already declared by a southerner, it was Thomas Jefferson. Equality of all men, irrespective of race or color. A doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law. They demand the abolition of Negro slavery throughout the Confederacy, the recognition of political equality between the white and Negro races, and avow their determination to press on their crusade against us so long as a Negro slave remains in these states. They're pretty straightforward here. It would be harder for them to be clearer about what they were worried about. For years past, this abolition organization, and remember, that's the Republican Party, which they just described as an abolition organization. You know it wasn't, I know it wasn't, they didn't know it wasn't. This abolition organization has been actively sowing the seeds of discord through the Union and has rendered the federal Congress the arena for spreading firebrands and hatred between the slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. By consolidating their strength, they placed the slaveholding states in a hopeless minority in the federal Congress. Mind you, it's not the tariff-paying states or something like that, it's the slaveholding states. In a hopeless minority in the federal Congress and rendered representation of no avail in protecting Southern rights against their exactions and encroachments. They have proclaimed, and in the ballot box sustained, the revolutionary doctrine that there is a higher law than the constitutional laws of our federal union. You're damn straight they did, and that higher law is in the Declaration of Independence. And virtually that they will disregard their oaths and trample upon our rights. They have for years past encouraged and sustained lawless organizations, that is, abolitionists and the Underground Railroad, to steal our slaves and prevent their recapture, and have repeatedly murdered Southern citizens while lawfully seeking their rendition. They've invaded Southern soil and murdered unoffending citizens, and through the press, their leading men and a fanatical pulpit have bestowed praise upon the actors and assassins in these crimes, while the governors of several of their states have refused to deliver parties implicated and indicted for participation in such offenses upon the legal demands of the states aggrieved. They have, through the mails and hired emissaries, sent seditious pamphlets and papers among us to stir up servile insurrection and bring blood and carnage to our firesides. Well, that sounds like we are not excited about free speech. They have sent hired emissaries among us to burn our towns and distribute arms and poison to our slaves for the same purpose. Now here's the thing, in the summer of 1860, as the election was heating up, so was Texas. It was the hottest summer on record, and there was a new kind of match that had just come into the market. They were being sold at a bunch of general stores in Dallas and a few other towns, and it turns out they're very delicate and they have a pretty low flash point, so they would just light on fire. So this happened in 3 northeastern Texas towns, most notably in Dallas, and given that it was extremely hot and extremely dry and there was a lot of wind, these fires spread really rapidly. Initially, everybody knew that they were accidents. Unfortunately, some fire-eaten newspaper editors decided that these absolutely had to be terrorist attacks by abolitionists. So they rounded up a whole bunch of Methodists, I think, a whole bunch of black people, hanged them all. So there was no such incendiary attack. They've impoverished the slaveholding states by unequal and partial legislation, thereby enriching themselves by draining our substance. And you know, we can have a reasonable discussion about tariffs, but you'll notice how big an issue that was to them. They refused appropriations for protecting Texas against ruthless savages for the sole reason that she's a slaveholding state. We've already heard about that. And finally, by the combined sectional vote of the 17 non-slaveholding states, they've elected as president and vice president of the whole Confederacy 2 men whose chief claims to such high positions are their approval of these long-continued wrongs and their pledges to continue them to the final consummation of these schemes for the ruin of the slaveholding states. So that's what they think of Abraham Lincoln. It's not what I think of him, it's not what you think of him, it's what they thought of him. And what they thought is what tells us what their motives were. In view of these and many other facts, it is meet that our own views should be distinctly proclaimed. We hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states and of the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and that in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. That in this free government all white men are and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights, that the servitude of the African race as existing in these states is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator as recognized by all Christian nations, while the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, as advocated by our sectional enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon both and desolation upon the 15 slaveholding states. By the secession of 6 of the slaveholding states and the certainty that others will speedily do likewise, Texas has no alternative but to remain in an isolated connection with the North or unite her destinies with the South. So the 6 southern states and a row leading east from Texas had already seceded as of when they wrote this, so Texas was at that point an isolated outpost of the Union. For these and other reasons, solemnly asserting that the federal Constitution has been violated and virtually abrogated by the several states named, seeing that the federal government is now passing under the control of our enemies to be diverted from the exalted objects of its creation to those of oppression and wrong, bear in mind what they mean by oppression and wrong. What they mean by oppression is they can't take enslaved people to New Mexico. And realizing that our own state can no longer look for protection but to God and her own sons, We, the delegates of the people of Texas and convention assembled, have passed an ordinance dissolving all political connection with the government of the United States of America and the people thereof, and confidently appeal to the intelligence and patriotism of the free men of Texas to ratify the same at the ballot box on the 23rd day of the present month, adopted in convention on the 2nd day of February in the year of our Lord 1861, and of the independence of Texas the 25th. That's what this monument is here to glorify, and that's why it's got to go away.